What gives international actors the ability to do what they do? What actually gives those with power that power in the first place? And what makes actions acceptable, either domestically or internationally? All these questions have to do with the concept of legitimacy, which is a central, important aspect of understanding global politics as a whole. At the heart of it, legitimacy is all about those sources of power that make actions acceptable. Now, let's start with thinking about legitimacy of states. Now, what makes a country or a state, right? A state has to have some level of sovereignty, meaning that it has control over its own affairs, as well as being seen as an equal with other states around the world. But what actually makes it that? Simply, it just has to do with the recognition of other states that, yes, you are an equal among us, right? Part of this is having a full seat at the United Nations. Another part of this is other states having diplomatic ties with you as a state. And so that's what would give a state legitimacy internationally. Now let's think about states and their domestic issues. So what makes a government legitimate? Well, in democratic states, it's the elections process and the fact that there's a constitution that governs and sets limits on what a government can and can't do. Therefore, the decisions that it makes are legitimate if that government is following the state's constitution and the will of the people. It's a little bit trickier sometimes with authoritarian states, where people might not have a say in who leads them. And sometimes these states are seen as having authority, but not legitimacy. However, in some cases, the people are still supportive of that state overall, even though they might not necessarily have a chance to say it in elections. Or on the flip side, sometimes those authoritarian states have so much control over the people that you can't speak out against them. And so their decisions aren't challenged. So sometimes that authority comes from military power, if it's a military dictatorship, or sometimes it's a dynastic authority where power is passed down from one generation to the next. And again, calling these legitimate is something debated in global politics about to what extent can their decisions on the people be seen as legitimate decisions if the people had no say from a democratic point of view. However, internationally, most states, even those authoritarian ones, are seen as equals in the global community. And so their actions are treated the same as the actions of a democratic state might be, right? So that's the legitimacy of state actors. But non-state actors also have a degree of power in the global community, especially if you think about the liberal view of looking at international relations. So let's think about NGOs or non-governmental organizations. What gives them legitimacy? What makes their actions acceptable in the states that they work in? Often it's their track record, right? So well-established NGOs like Doctors Without Borders or Amnesty International have been around for a really long time. Often it's also funding, right? Well-supported organizations in terms of being able to raise a lot of money are able to do more. And so their ability to actually do more would give them more legitimacy as well. At the end of the day, however, NGOs are often at the mercy of sovereign decisions of sovereign states. If a state decides that an NGO can't work within that state, well then you're in a tricky situation where that NGO's power is going to be very severely limited. So a lot of the legitimacy of NGOs comes from permission given by sovereign states. Also very important actors in the world today are transnational corporations, or TNCs. Now, as you can imagine, with corporations, a major source of their legitimacy is the economic power that they wield. One example of this is how places often try to make a situation as friendly as possible for big corporations to set up shop, whether it's create a new office or create a manufacturing center in a particular state. And so states will aim to have friendly tax policies or other benefits to corporations for those corporations to establish themselves there. And other non-state actors, like extremist organizations, for example, gain legitimacy from people supporting them. And the more support an extremist organization might get for their cause, well, the more legitimate they might be to their people, even though extremist organizations globally will have very little legitimacy and acceptance of the things that they do. But to their own people, their own followers, they might be seen as more legitimate than even the governments in power in those areas where they operate. Now, when we talk about legitimacy, we also want to talk about the legitimacy of actions taken by states in the international world. Like, for example, what makes one country use its military power on another, violating their sovereignty, possibly legitimate? In this case, it might be the existence of a United Nations Security Council resolution that authorizes that military action. Like, for example, the international intervention in Libya to overthrow the government of Muammar Gaddafi. In other areas, it would be adherence to other customs as part of the international system of global governance. So, for example, in issues of trade, it would be making sure to abide by policies set out by the World Trade Organization or individual free trade agreements between countries. And that's what would give those actions legitimacy. As you can imagine, often views on legitimacy are contested, especially in places around the world where the legitimacy of the government is in question. One example of this is the contested leadership of Venezuela, where longtime President Nicolas Maduro is trying to stave off the challenger Juan Guaido, who has the support of a lot of the international community behind him, right? And so several countries are siding with Maduro, several countries are siding with Guaido. Both are saying that they are the legitimate leaders of Venezuela, right? And sometimes international actions have also happened without gaining legitimacy from established global customs. Like, for example, the US invasion of Iraq in the early 2000s, where there was no UN Security Council resolution to authorize that invasion, but the US cobbled together a coalition of willing countries to support their action to overthrow Saddam Hussein.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
Now, to this day, many countries around the world, many actors see that invasion as illegitimate because of that lack of a UN Security Council resolution. But it still happened, and the US is a very powerful country, and so we kind of see where there's a little bit of a challenge here, where at the end of the day, maybe those with power still have the ability to take actions, even potentially not legitimate ones, and face very little meaningful pushback because of the power they wield, like that of the United States. And so issues around legitimacy are some of the major sources of conflict in the world today, whether it's constitutional crises or violations of another country's sovereignty. And so legitimacy begs some pretty major questions about where it comes from. Has legitimacy been shifting over time? And is global governance, the way that it exists, strong enough to be able to determine what actions are legitimate or not? Or do states still have a lot of power to do those things on their own? What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. If you learned something today, give this video a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and we will see you again next time.